and welcome to Groundbreakers with Charles and Alice Dagit. Hi, I'm Alice. Groundbreakers is a series about the history of American architecture and specifically how it's been molded by the American dream, the American character which simply bursts with ingenuity and invention. In this series, we're discovering the ways in which architects and their designs have been molded by our culture, our economics, our environment, our social and political fabric. We go from place to place through a timeline to show how these influences indelibly shaped the architecture that surrounds us today. This is the American story of the innovation and entrepreneurial spirit that has created the architectural treasures we have. We hope that as you walk around your towns and cities, you will look up with renewed curiosity and ask, how come? Previously, we examined the formulaic plantation houses of Virginia, that colony's capital, Williamsburg, and the neoclassical architecture of Thomas Jefferson. We contrasted them with the more quirky residences of Annapolis, Maryland. We then looked at how the Civil War dramatically fueled innovation, focusing on Philadelphia and Boston, where the enormously groundbreaking architects Frank Furness and H.H. Richardson completely rejected tradition and pioneered in startling new directions. Next, we visited Chicago to view the paradigm-shifting work of Louis Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright. Then on to the West Coast, where Pasadena and San Francisco were fed by the brand new cross-continental railroads. Now today we'll travel to Tulsa, Detroit, and Los Angeles, where another stunning invention, the automobile, and the oil needed to power it, jump-started their growth and the careers of Eero Saarinen, Bruce Goff, and Rudolph Schindler. We have with us award-winning architect Charles Dagit, who holds Pennsylvania's coveted Gold Medal of Distinction. A member of the College of Fellows of the American Institute of Architects, Charles has won over 60 regional, national, and design awards, and he has written a fascinating book on this very subject. Welcome, Charlie. What are you going to tell us about today?
Well, today we're going to venture into the heartland of the country. We've spent our time in the past episodes on the coasts, and today we're going to explore the architecture that began to blossom in the middle of the country, and particularly in of all places, Tulsa, Oklahoma. And Tulsa, Oklahoma is an interesting place because unlike the places that we've looked at, is not a seaport. Oklahoma is thoroughly landlocked. And the distinction that Tulsa had and the beginning of its wealth was because of its location. And the location was between St. Louis, Missouri and the Texas ranches, the cattle ranches. And all the cattle that came to Missouri was driven through Tulsa. And that's where the beginning of the wealth of that town began to emerge. And all of a sudden, they discovered oil. And in the early 20s of the 19th century, Tulsa became the oil capital of the world.
Oh, my goodness.
Very few people know that. We keep thinking of OPEC and the Middle East and so on, but Tulsa was it.
Wow. And
it had enormous wealth pouring into it. It already had accumulated the wealth from the cattle. Now it's got the oil. And the oil was spurred by the growing demand of the automobile. And so the automobile actually is kind of the focus of these couple of places we're going to explore today. So why Tulsa and why Bruce Goff? I explained Tulsa. Bruce Goff came to Tulsa because his parents moved from West Texas to Tulsa, for what reason I'm not quite sure. But anyway, he ended up in Tulsa. And Tulsa had a very rich tradition of Art Deco architecture at the time. And he was very talented as a young man, and he exhibited an affinity for drawing. His father sensed that and took him into the city and found an architectural firm, Rush, Endicott and Rush, and talked to them, and he quickly became apprenticed to that town.
So he was only a teenager or something at that time?
He was only a teenager.
Okay.
He had already won a competition for a house design sponsored by Indiana Limestone. And he then began his career at that firm. And the first thing he worked on was the Boston Avenue Methodist Church, which was a very big commission. And that church was the capstone to begin his career. And he took off. And it was Art Deco inspired to somewhat. The richness of its detail was really quite extraordinary. And the tower was to reflect light. And he was very interested in light and glass and so on and so forth. So that was his first work. But it was a restrained work by comparison with the work that Bruscoff eventually did. And today is a real treat, because if there was ever an architect that was off the wall, it was Bruscoff.
Oh, neat.
And we'll look at one of his first projects was the CB Chapel. And he was commissioned by the Navy to do a chapel, and so he made the chapel out of a Quonset hut.
Oh, jeez.
And he was inspired by the cathedrals and so forth, and he put a clear story along the Quonset hut, and the light inside that domed space was really extraordinary. But he then proceeds to go really off the wall. He designs a house called the Bavinger House, which is a pure piece of sculpture. It is an amazing spiral shape with a roof that swirls around and goes to a pinnacle. It's a house that no one has ever imagined. And I must say that he was very influenced originally by Frank Lloyd Wright and the organic architecture that Wright espoused, but he took over organic architecture like a passion with the Bavinger House. He then did a whole series of houses, the Ledbetter House. He did a house in Chicago because during the war he moved to Chicago. His firm was, because of the Depression, was ultimately succumbed to the Depression. And he moved to Chicago, and he was the art director for Libby Owens Ford Glass Company. And he did a house in Chicago called the Bachman House, which is another off-the-wall house, and it's very much reminiscent of the work of the San Francisco architect
Maybeck.
And then he does a house called the Tiero House, which I only have the plan of, but it's a triangle of all things. No one has done a triangular house in history. He's the first to step into that kind of geometry. And it's a bizarre house, truly a bizarre house. And then he goes into pure sculpture, and he creates the Grider House. And the Grider House is a fantasy house, absolute fantasy house. Its detailing is absurd. And his last work is the Pavilion for Japanese Art that he created. He was a remarkable architect, and he was not really recognized for his advanced creativity by many in the country. Very few people put Bruscoff into the category of the other architects that we've ever talked about. First of all, because he was in Tulsa from all places.
Right.
And second of all, he never really promoted himself as an architect, and he never got, because of the Depression and the war, the commissions that the other architects began to get. And then in his late career, the kind of attraction dissipated because other forms of architecture were coming along. So that leads us to Detroit.
Well, and how come Detroit?
Well, Detroit is an interesting place because, of course, it was the home of the automobile. Why Detroit for the automobile? Well, first of all, Detroit was in the heartland, but it was a seaport. And if you're going to have cars and create cars, you need a seaport. Detroit is right next to the steel-making cities of Pittsburgh and the places in Akron, Ohio, and so forth that manufacture steel. And you need sheet steel for cars. But you also need other materials like rubber. And there's Akron, Ohio, which is importing rubber like crazy because of the car. You also need textiles, leathers, and so on, and that's because of the seaport. So you've got the coal and steel right next door in Pennsylvania and in Ohio, and then the seaport, which brings all the other materials together to create a car.
And these industries, steel, rubber, etc., were just growth industries.
They were growth industries, and Henry Ford saw the power of the sheet steel to make cars, and so he therefore made the car. And Detroit became the natural place for that to happen.
Right.
So who ends up in Detroit but a man named Eero Saarinen? And his father was, from Finland, and Eero was born in Finland. His father came to America because he was asked to come to America by Cranbrook.
What's Cranbrook?
Cranbrook is a school of art. And he came to Cranbrook to teach architecture. And his wife was an expert designer of textiles.
And she taught at Cranbrook
She
as well?
taught at the school next to Cranbrook, was a girls' school.
Okay.
And so Eero Saarinen, in his very youth, is totally surrounded by architecture, art, tapestry, weaving, and so on and so forth. He was very talented, same as Bruce Goff, at a very young age, showed a capacity to draw. And during that time period, his father was commissioned to design the General Motors Technical Center, which was a huge commission. His father, shortly after, dies.
Oh.
Eero Saarinen managed to keep the commission. And he gains, as a very young architect, one of the hugest commissions you can imagine, to a burgeoning company that is breaking all records in terms of its wealth.
Wow.
And
being in the right place at the right time.
He creates the technical center, and he based the design of the technical center on very international style, and we'll get to international style next week, but glass and steel combinations. And because of that design of that project, he got the John Deere building, an IBM center, a CBS building, all designed in the international style. But that's one half of Eero Saarinen. That's the rational side of Eero Saarinen. What we're going to look at today.
That's the left brain side of Eero Saarinen.
That's the left brain. The right brain side of Eero Saarinen takes over overwhelmingly in a number of buildings that he did. Primarily, the first building that he did is not a building. It's a symbol.
It's a symbol?
He designed the St. Louis Arch.
Oh.
And the St. Louis Arch went on to become equal to the Eiffel Tower and other symbolic sculptural gestures that cities create in order to draw attention to themselves. And the St. Louis Arch is also a real groundbreaker in terms of the mechanics of the arch. The arch is all made out of metal panels. They're so precision made. Of course, it's a Finn. And the German heritage of the Finnish exquisite mounting of these pieces of steel together to form this arch. And in some ways it is a building because you can go inside it and you can climb all the way up to the top of the arch, which probably people don't even know.
And then you can see all the way west and all the way east.
Well, I don't know how you peek out of it because it's all pretty solid,
Oh,
but
okay.
I'd have to explore that further. But anyway, so it's a piece of sculpture, but it embodies the same kind of qualities that the University of Virginia did in exposing the whole notion of the West, because it says through here the West happened.
Well, it's called the Gateway Arch.
It's the gateway. It's the
Right.
gateway to the West.
Uh-huh.
And it was a competition. He won that competition. Louis Kahn, we'll look at next time, also did that competition. Eero Saarinen won it and created this giant arch. And it
There were other big names that
it
were
was a
in
brilliant.
that
Oh yes,
competition
it was
too.
an amazing competition.
Yeah.
And he won the competition. He then went on, because of those buildings, to begin to design works that are very spirited and very sculptural, and that is the Dulles Airport and the TWA
Oh, the terminal.
terminal.
Most people can picture that probably.
Yeah, Dulles was his first airport commission. Interesting enough, it was a unique concept of airport because you got in a van carrier to get on the plane. So you didn't go down all the arms to get into the plane. You got into a conveyor truck or bus.
Like a tram or something?
Like tram, and then got in the plane. The TWA, or Dulles, has this incredibly swooping roof. And it is about to take off in flight. And when you walk in there, you look up and there's this giant swooping roof and says, oh my gosh, I'm about to fly. And it celebrated what flying was then, which was far more than what we know it today, which is getting in a flying bus.
That was it was an exciting adventure.
It was very much of an adventure. It was like going on the Queen Mary or the other great ships.
And it was very, I won't say formal, but you dressed up for it because it was very special.
And the notion of the Dulles Airport was more like Penn Station in New York, the welcoming
the old Penn
center,
Station.
yeah,
the
impressive welcoming center, a giant space that could anticipate the city that you're going to, having come from that great experience of flying. So Dulles was a remarkable revolution in airport design. But the most other remarkable airport design was the TWA.
Yeah.
And the TWA is a complete manifestation of sculpture in architecture. He makes it look like a bird.
Yes. In flight.
In flight. And you're flying, you're going into the TWA Center to fly all over the world. And you're about to take off when you get into the terminal. Your feet are lifted about 2 inches off the ground to look up and see what kind of an incredible experience this is. And I'm about to board a plane. And what a fabulous interpretation of the whole gift of flight and its uniqueness that the Wright brothers gave to man and so forth.
Yeah.
And his work actually became, quite frankly, the platform for Frank Gehry.
Frank Gehry.
Yeah, to make sculpture out of architecture. And he did that before the advent of the computer. Can you imagine this building being drawn in any way, shape, or form without geometry?
That roof line.
And the whole thing is a piece of sculpture, and he designs it and draws it and is capable of drawing it without the aid of the computer. No one quite clearly can figure out how he did it, but he was a master at being able to draw, and he managed to put that building together. How the contractors put it together is also
going to say the
complete
engineers.
Mystery. And it is a magnificent engineering piece that is quite extraordinary. But that's the dual personality of Eero Saarinen, from the rational to the empirical. And he's quite an extraordinary character in American architecture because he's one of the only ones that crosses that line of right-brained and left-brained.
That's true. That's interesting. Well, I didn't know whether it was true, but that's very
interesting.
interesting.
Yeah, he's one of the few.
Yeah.
Most of the architects simply stick to their original principles and don't deviate from it. He was very dexterous, multilingual in a way, and quite an amazing architect. Which leads us to ultimately, again, back to the automobile.
Okay.
And to a new invention that came across the American scene, and that is the motion picture industry. And the motion picture industry began obviously in Los Angeles. And Los Angeles was looked upon as the height of modern sophistication in an urban environment.
Because it was so brand new.
It was so brand new.
And it was hip.
And there was oil there.
Oh, okay. So it had that new industry, and it had
the new
oil.
industry, and it had the climate, as we explored with Pasadena.
True.
So combine the oil, the climate, and the film industry, and you have the perfect stir pot for invention and incredible architecture. Rudolph Schindler is in Los Angeles. He came from Vienna. He was born in Vienna. He was educated in Vienna, and he was educated as an architect and an engineer. And he was very influenced by the European moderns, Otto Wagner and a fellow of mine named Adolf Loos. And he was also influenced quite a bit by European art. And we'll look at it later that unlike some of the other architects like Green and Green, who was right next door in Pasadena, where arts and crafts, Schindler is really influenced by European modern art. So
And this would be in the 20s and 30s?
20s and 30s.
Okay.
So he's a European, and he brings all of that baggage to Los Angeles, and they're looking for something very modern. And if you really think about it, Los Angeles was the home of also Richard Neutra. By the way, Richard Neutra and Rudolph Schindler were partners at one time, and Neutra hated him so much that he did not allow him in the show on modern architecture that was created by Philip Johnson in New York.
Which you'll get to another time.
I'll get to.
Okay. Okay.
Anyway, Otto Wagner Rudolph Schindler comes to Los Angeles, and he starts working for, and he already knew Frank Lloyd Wright, and he starts working for Frank Lloyd Wright, and he supervised the Hollyhock House.
Ah.
So, and it's because of that, he was hired, his engineering experience that he was hired by Wright, because Wright was working on the Imperial Hotel in Japan. And all of the earthquake influence of the Tokyo architecture and Los Angeles was crucial to Schindler's career. So he's an engineer and an architect.
Okay.
And he admired Wright. And he's also influenced by Irving Gill, who is working in Los Angeles and is the beginnings of the modern movement in America. So he designs a house called the Buck House, and the Buck House is a very geometric house, all white and very, very modern, and very influenced by Adolf Loos, who was against any ornamentation whatsoever.
Okay.
So it's very crisp, very modern in its intent, and its interior is quite extraordinary as well. He then designs a house which stands out called the Lovell Beach House. And the Lovell Beach House is an amazing house on pilotis, which is columns that come from the ground and are all open and let the landscape flow through the house. And he cantilevers the house over the beach so that it just sort of hovers as cantilevers. And he precurses Falling Water by Frank Lloyd Wright by several years.
Oh my.
Several decades, actually. He is the precursor to American modernism, in my view. Very few people know of him or think of him because he was rejected by Philip Johnson as a modern architect because he had Wrightian details. And Wright was now on the lower end of the acceptance level from modern architects.
And Philip Johnson and Frank Lloyd Wright were
Were
very
absolutely
like oil and water,
oil and water.
so to speak.
He goes on to design the Elliott House, the Wolf House, and then finally the Bethlehem Baptist Church, which is another extraordinary house that is really amazingly abstract and a wonderful space inside. So he begins the whole trek towards Richard Meier and the moderners of the 1960s by 50 years.
Whoa.
And his work is so advanced that it never really surfaces until that time, in 50 years later, when people begin to look back and say, whoa, this guy is really somebody. And
well, of course, he was designing for people in this brand new up-and-coming industry, and a word I used a couple of minutes ago was hip. It was a hip new industry, and I don't want to use the word avant-garde because there are avant-garde people in New York and other places, but it would have been a city that was more populated with avant-garde people because they're dreaming up the new art of the future.
Well, that's right, and I would describe his work as abstract cubism.
Now, what's abstract cubism?
Well, the Cubist the movement was a European art movement, Picasso and Braque and so forth.
Right.
And it abstracted shape so that the human form became angular.
Right.
What Schindler does is transcribe that into an architecture of cubes that are hanging in space and so on and so forth. And the other thing that is interesting about the modernism of it is that Los Angeles, as you say, is the heartland of modernism. If we go back and look at, and many who are watching won't even remember or know, but you should look it up, of Reagan's incredible advertisements for General Electric were all done in Los Angeles with the lights out in the city below, these picture windows that embraced modernism like you wouldn't believe. And Schindler was the first to embrace that through his architecture.
Okay.
As well as Neutra, but I don't speak of Neutra that much because he was an imported architect, as many of the others who came to America and practiced architecture and learned their trait elsewhere and then came to America to practice it.
Okay.
And I've not really gone through them in the book because this is strictly American invention.
So you mentioned the abstract cubism, and of course, architecture is the perfect vehicle for cubism, making it three-dimensional.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it as with golf, who is organic, this now becomes sculptural by virtue of interposing cubes all over the place to make its architecture, and planes. It's
true.
It's very plane-like, and of course is influenced by Adolf Loos, who disparaged ornament, and it wasn't until Bob Venturi came along 60 years later who revived the idea
the tables,
of ornament.
Really. He
Turned the
tables.
Yes,
yeah.
he did.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. So that brings us to today, and it really brings us through golf and Saarinen and Schindler, the birth of real American modern architecture. And we'll see how that's carried on in the next couple of segments.
So yes, these last few, we started this series on the East Coast, obviously, because that's where the population was, and through the Civil War, that's where all the activity was, and then we went to the Midwest and the West, and that's where a lot of the modernism, as you say, was thriving and being nurtured.
Yeah.
So now we'll soon be back to the East Coast.
That's
Is that right?
Right.
Huh. Well, why don't I tell the audience about that? So, we've explored the beginnings of American modernism in the West. So next time we'll come back to Philadelphia, the home of the Philadelphia School, and then on to New York to examine the international style of Roach Dinkeloo, Philip Johnson, and I.M. Pei, and the ultra-modernism of Richard Meier and Michael Graves. Be sure to be with us then. Bye-bye.